Hi everyone, I'm Sophie Milburn, editor of the MSP channel Insights portfolio, and I'm joined today by Greg from TeamViewer. We actually met in Berlin recently, so I'm really glad that we've got the opportunity to speak again. So, kind of before we dive into the main questions, do you want to introduce yourself and your role?
So thanks, Sophie. So I'm Greg Gyves. I lead the Global MSP and GSI function at TeamViewer, a relatively new function as of last summer. Although we have a very large base of MSPs and GSIs, what we're doing is really investing properly in a dedicated function to really improve our go-to-market model and the MSP partner model. So it's great to join you on this call.
Amazing. Thank you. Great start. So from your perspective, working with MSP partners in the UK in particular, what are some of the kind of the biggest challenges that MSPs are facing right now that you're seeing when it comes to kind of managing and supporting client environments?
Yeah, so I think there's so one of the most clearest things that always sticks out to me, and it's probably relevant to any size of MSP and any level of maturity, is a couple of distinctly competing pressures, which is extending the management boundary and covering more of the customer's estate. And that naturally comes from sometimes a desire from within the MSP, but it also, if you do a good job, it comes from the customer because they want you to do more, which is great, but that brings its own challenges in terms of, broadening, covering more complex parts of the estate and keeping things simple in terms of operations, or as simple as possible. And that's really competing with the need to add additional layers of differentiation, different levels of maturity, and so the two don't always go together. So that can be quite a challenge for the MSP. So basically, how do they extend their management boundary, maintain a certain level of operational efficiency, and also add different levels of complexity into the service delivery model. So it's that's an ongoing challenge. I think hits all sides of MSPs.
Yeah, and I know we spoke about it at the event as well, but with all those things, there's so much to think about. Then comes the burnout and the tool sprawl and workload and all of those things. I feel like I'm having so many conversations about that recently.
Yeah.
So where are you kind of seeing TeamViewer help with those things and kind of address some of those challenges?
Yeah, so I think there's one of the most obvious areas in terms of reducing tool sprawl is in terms of how TeamViewer can help is the ability to connect to and manage any device with any OS.
Right.
And that's a differentiator for TeamViewer because when you consider all of the customer's estate across IT, IoT, industrial IoT, and then OT, or operational technology, particularly relevant when you look at manufacturing, logistics, energies, utilities companies who have a very sort of broad estate, it can be a challenge. And so if your standard tool set is more suited to IT, to cover those other areas of the estate, you have to add more tools, which brings complexity, which brings a need for broader set of skills. So TeamViewer really sits in that unified layer where it doesn't discriminate against device type or operating system type, and when deployed effectively, can be a real powerful layer in the service stack.
Yeah, and you've kind of, I guess, slightly started to cover my next question about differentiating itself, but I'll ask anyway in case there's anything that you want to kind of, add on to that. The remote access tools are kind of everywhere in the MSP stack. So where does TeamViewer differentiate itself when MSPs are deciding what platform to kind of build their operations around?
Yeah, so you're right. Remote access tools are everywhere, and if you look at sort of the baseline functionality of remotely connecting to a device and I suppose solving a software issue, that's quite a commoditized area, right? I think if you look at the broader sort of picture in terms of endpoint management, there's a number of different layers with that, and that's where, and having one vendor with a platform or a set of solutions that can cover multiple layers in terms of managing the estate is where TeamViewer is in a fairly unique position, I believe. So when I'm talking about the different layers, what I'm talking about is the first primary layer, which is a certain level of automation and self-healing on the endpoint to reduce the need for a ticket in the first place. So how do you have an automation that solves a problem in advance before it becomes a problem for the user? Because it only generates a ticket when it becomes a problem for the user. So if you can resolve that issue ahead proactively, you don't need to create a ticket. So that's the first layer. You've then got the need to, if the ticket is created, how do you then effectively resolve that ticket? Now you can introduce AI to help with that, and that's not just TeamViewer. That's where integration with things like ServiceNow comes in. But also then when you need to connect to a device, you want that ubiquitous layer to connect to any device from within whatever the standard workflow is. So if you're using ServiceNow or Freshworks as your ITSM, ideally you want to embed it into that workflow.
Yeah. And you mentioned there something that was mentioned quite a few times at the TeamViewer event recently was that proactive rather than the reactive approach, particularly when it comes to kind of security. So what kind of, I guess, investments or capabilities has TeamViewer introduced to help MSPs maintain kind of trust with that it is going to happen proactively rather than reactively?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a first thing is with regards to having a secure remote support layer, you need a strong layers of enterprise grade security. So firstly, that's single sign-on. So whoever's connecting to a device is authenticating via the corporate authentication method. Then the only people who can access are employees. You can't have any people who've since left the business who just know the credentials, right? So that SSO layer is still fairly standard layer, but it's quite a critical one. Then you've got conditional access, and so that's more about having granular policies and role-based access control to be able to maintain control of who accesses what devices when, based on certain policies and rules that are in place. So you can't just have anybody accessing any device. It's quite granular in terms of it being locked down. And then you've got auditability, so being able to track that and audit that over time. So you've got a log, which is quite critical in terms of industry regulations, and especially if you have to adhere to ISO 27000 compliance and things like that. So there's a lot of enterprise grade functionality with regards to security built into the product, and so there's a number of different areas which we take very seriously in terms of security in the product, security in our infrastructure, our compliance against certain regulations and compliance frameworks. So it might be FedRAMP in the US, or it might be a healthcare in the UK. We're very mindful of being compliant against those types of regulations, because if we're not, then it becomes a blocker to a service provider using our technology if they're serving those sectors. So there's a number of different areas where security becomes very prominent in our approach.
Amazing. And with all of that, with all of the security and all of the AI and automation, everything that comes into that, what do you see as the kind of biggest upcoming opportunities for MSPs to kind of utilize that in the near future?
Well, I think the first thing is that well, there's two things that spring to mind there. One is to feed the AI, and to have an AI model that you can have a certain level of trust in, you need to feed it accurate data. And so that's where the telemetry from our endpoint agents comes in, because what you need is the ability to capture a very rich library of data points, right? And so that's the first thing, because without that, you don't really have the right insight to feed the AI model, right? And again, that's where TeamViewer, and particularly 1E, who we acquired on the DEX, the digital employee experience front, really strong. So that's one thing. The second thing is it's also about the use case of where you want to apply it, and at what point do you let the AI make the decision to execute, versus having a human make that decision. And I think that's where, there's a lot of hype, of course, which is great. I'm a big fan of hype, but I also know that from a managed service perspective, the managed service providers have to kind of cut through a bit of the hype to make sense of, okay, how does this apply in the
where does it actually work?
The real world. So I think there's a lot of MSPs looking at how they can take some measured steps towards leveraging that. But I don't see it being a one size fits all sort of revolution. It's more of an evolution in terms of the way it'll be applied.
How would you say that MSPs can go about demonstrating their value? I feel like a lot of the time, I'm having a lot of conversations about this as well. MSPs are kind of recognize when things go wrong and when, security kind of fails and all of those things. Is there anything that TeamViewer are kind of doing to help make them kind of get that recognition before things go wrong?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point, actually, because this is an area that's been quite close to my heart over the last probably 6, 7, 8 years. So certainly not limited to my time at TeamViewer. Everything that's happening in their estate, right? And I've seen some really good examples of that, where, again, what the service provider is doing is they've built a proprietary sort of dashboard that the customer gets as part of the service, and they feed a lot of those data points in and normalize the data and present it in a meaningful way to the customer. So that's a really powerful way of demonstrating to the customer, this is what we're doing.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that spoken about before, so I didn't know if that was something that was kind of happening. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And or it could be, and that's where the providers got their own proprietary IP with that piece. That becomes a really powerful way to demonstrate value to the customer. So that's where in the MSP program that we're launching, or that we launched last year, it's a continual sort of work in progress. A big part of it is having a service-centric engagement model. And what I mean by that is being able to articulate to the provider how a service could look using TeamViewer technology. And that's where I think, from my experience, a lot of vendors are slightly wide of the mark in terms of their approach to MSPs. Because if our engagement model for MSPs revolves around everything TeamViewer does, it misses the point in terms of enabling them to deliver a service using that technology. So the easiest way to frame it is we talk about the service you can deliver with TeamViewer more than just talking about TeamViewer. And that really brings an empathy and an understanding and a desire to understand what service the provider is delivering. And that comes back to what we were talking about with your presentation layers and feedback and demonstrating value.
Yeah.
Because we have to help the service provider not just do a good job in terms of delivery, but do a good job in terms of packaging what they offer and deliver to the customer, so that they remain sticky to the customer. Because if we help them remain sticky to the customer, it generally forms a good foundation for a partnership between us and the provider as well.
If we were to have this conversation again in maybe like 2 or 3 years, you think that the whole thing that we've spoken about, what do you think that MSPs will be or should be doing differently in that time? And how is TeamViewer kind of playing a part in that future?
Yeah, so you're testing my forward thinking there. So I think, look, there's a lot of change and things are changing so quickly that actually, however I answer this now, I'll probably have a different answer in 3 or 6 months, maybe even a month, right? But I think one thing is clear with the service provider community is if you increase the amount of automation, what that has to do is it has to free up manual or human effort to change. If you look to increase the amount of automation in your service delivery model, the impact then has to be the benefit, sorry, has to be on enabling the workforce to think differently, forward plan, look at a competitive edge. How do they, how can they be freed up to focus on more meaningful tasks, right? And that's across the organisation. So I think if we look forward at 3 years and the MSPs, I'd like to think that we have a very strong community of MSP partnerships in the UK and globally, and we build on that foundation that we've got. And I'd like to think that TeamViewer enables MSPs to really have a strong digital workplace services practice, because it goes way beyond remote support, right? We're a digital workplace company. So if you look across our whole portfolio, from endpoint automation with DEX to unified remote connectivity or automated workflows and business application integration on the frontline side, there's a broad portfolio that we've got. What it means is for service providers, there's a lot of opportunity to improve the way that they deliver digital workplace services. And so the providers who can do that the best, and that's again what we're focusing on, leveraging their IP and helping them leverage ours, are the ones who will probably make the biggest difference in the market.
Amazing. Well, I'm excited to see what actually happens in the next couple of months and the next couple of years. So yeah, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah. Okay. No worries. Well, thanks for having me, and I look forward to speaking again.